The day the Blitzkrieg met its match. June 22nd, 1941. Near the town of Grodno, western Belarus. The morning sun bled through a haze of smoke as Panzer III tanks rolled across the open fields, their engines humming like a swarm of angry hornets. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, was in full swing. Dust rose behind columns of gray steel. Officers barked orders through open hatches, and Luftwaffe bombers droned overhead, striking roads and bridges miles ahead. The Wehrmacht was unstoppable, or so it believed. In his command tank, Oberst Heinrich Eberbach studied the battlefield through binoculars. Soviet resistance had been erratic, poorly coordinated infantry, outdated armor, scattered artillery fire. He muttered under his breath, "Primitive, they're still fighting the last war." Around him, confidence pulsed through every radio transmission. The Blitzkrieg had never failed before. Poland, France, the Balkans, each crushed in weeks. Then a voice crackled through the radio. "Unknown armor ahead. Repeat, unknown Soviet tank type approaching." Eberbach frowned. He ordered his unit to halt and watched as black dots appeared on the horizon, moving slowly, deliberately. Through the haze he could see their silhouettes, broad turrets, low profiles, sloped armor glinting in the morning light. "Probably more of those clumsy T-26s, his adjutant laughed. "We'll burn them before breakfast." But as the distance closed, the first 50-millimeter shells from the German line ricocheted harmlessly off the newcomers' hulls. Sparks flew. The Soviet tanks kept advancing. One of them stopped, rotated its gun, and fired. A Panzer III erupted in flame, its turret blown off in an instant. The laughter stopped. Eberbach's heart pounded. "Fire! Fire! Target the tracks!" he shouted. The German guns barked again. Same result. The strange tanks shrugged off the hits and rolled closer, firing back with deafening precision. Within minutes, the entire forward line was in chaos. Smoke swallowed the fields. Crews abandoned burning machines. "Mein Gott," Eberbach whispered. "What are those things?" Over the radio came a shaken voice. "They call it T-34. The battlefield fell silent except for the crackle of fire and the groan of wounded metal. For the first time since the invasion began, the German commander realized something terrible. His vaunted Blitzkrieg had just met an opponent it couldn't simply roll over. The machine that shouldn't have existed. The T-34 seemed to appear from nowhere, an enigma on tracks. But deep inside the Soviet Union, its creation had been anything but sudden. 2 years earlier, in 1939, the Kharkiv-Komintern locomotive plant in Ukraine had been alive with secret activity. Engineers worked in freezing workshops under the supervision of Mikhail Kushkin, a stubborn designer with a relentless vision. His team was tasked with building a tank that could survive the vast, punishing terrain of Russia and outfight any enemy machine. Most of the Red Army still relied on flimsy, pre-war tanks, the BT-7s and T-26s, thin-skinned relics of a different era. They were fast on roads, but hopeless in mud, snow, or against serious firepower. Kushkin wanted something different, a tank that could fight as well as it could move. His design broke every convention. Sloped armor at 45 degrees to deflect shells instead of absorbing them, wide tracks for snow and mud, a powerful 76.2mm gun capable of piercing German armor. And above all, simplicity. No delicate gears, no complex parts that would choke in the dust or freeze in the cold. When he presented it to the Soviet hierarchy, officials frowned. It was too heavy, too ambitious, too untested.
Kushkin knew they didn't believe it would work, so he decided to prove them wrong the only way he could, by driving it to Moscow himself. In early 1940, he led 2 prototype T-34s on a grueling 1,800-kilometer test run through mud, rivers, and blizzards. The machines arrived in Moscow battered but functional, a miracle of endurance. Stalin approved mass production on the spot. The Germans had no idea that even as their Blitzkrieg raged through Europe, thousands of these tanks were quietly being assembled in Soviet factories. When Barbarossa began, most T-34s were still scattered or untested, crewed by half-trained soldiers. But even in those chaotic first weeks, the impact was seismic. Reports began flooding into Berlin. Our shells cannot penetrate its front armor. It outclimbs and outruns the Panzer III. It's impervious to 37mm anti-tank guns. At first, German commanders dismissed them as exaggerated, until they saw one in person. Near Dubno, an entire column of Panzers was held up by just 4 T-34s blocking a crossroads. For hours, the Soviet tanks tore into German armor, destroying dozens before finally being overwhelmed. When the smoke cleared, even the victors were silent. One officer wrote in his report, "It is the perfect tank for this terrain. We have nothing like it." The Wehrmacht's unstoppable storm had just found its wall, and that wall was painted green.
Panic in the Wehrmacht. By late summer 1941, the German advance was still pushing deep into Soviet territory, but beneath the triumphal reports lay a growing sense of unease. Field officers whispered of a tank that defied every rule of engagement. Commanders who once mocked Soviet armor now demanded new weapons, heavier guns, thicker armor, anything that could stop the T-34. At the front lines, that unease turned to dread. Outside Smolensk, Panzer Lieutenant Karl Meyer watched as his unit crested a ridge and spotted several T-34s positioned among the birch trees below. "Engage," he ordered. His gunners fired the first volley, bright flashes cutting through the smoke. The shells sparked harmlessly against the sloped armor, ricocheting away like pebbles off stone. Then came the reply. The Soviet guns roared. A 76mm round struck Meyer's lead Panzer square in the turret, ripping through the steel as if it were paper. Within seconds, flames poured out. Another shell slammed into a half-track, flipping it over. The radio crackled with chaos. "We can't penetrate. Their armor's invincible. We're falling back. Repeat, falling back." The T-34s advanced methodically, unhurried, like predators closing in for the kill. German infantry scattered across the fields, their anti-tank rifles useless. In the aftermath, Meyer wrote bitterly in his log, "We are no longer the hunters. We are the hunted." At German headquarters, reports like his piled high. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance photos confirmed the scale of the problem. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of these mysterious tanks moving across the steppe. General Heinz Guderian, architect of the Blitzkrieg, inspected a captured T-34 personally. He climbed atop the burnt hole, rapped his knuckles on the armor, and stared in silence. Finally, he turned to his officers and said, "This machine is superior to any we have in service." For a force built on momentum, the realization was devastating. The T-34's combination of speed, protection, and firepower nullified the very essence of Blitzkrieg, the lightning strike. German tanks could still outmaneuver or outgun individual Soviet vehicles, but in open combat, the math was brutal. Worse, the terrain favored the Soviets. In the mud and snow of Russia, the T-34 thrived. Its wide tracks glided where German treads bogged down. Its diesel engine kept running when others froze solid. Even in retreat, Soviet tank crews could fight, ambush, and vanish again. And while the Germans scrambled to develop answers, the Panzer IV upgrades, the new Panther, and the massive Tiger, they were already months behind. In the cold forests and endless fields, the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht began to crack. The Blitzkrieg, once defined by speed and arrogance, now met something it could neither outthink nor outrun.
The turning steel of the East. Winter came early that year. The temperature near Moscow plunged below -30 degrees Celsius, freezing oil in engines and turning the roads into glass. German soldiers, still wearing summer uniforms, huddled around campfires made from broken crates and map boards. Their supply lines were stretched thin, and their tanks, symbols of the Blitzkrieg, were choking in the cold. But the T-34s kept moving. In the forests north of Tula, a Soviet armored column prepared to strike back. Snow muffled their engines as crews adjusted their fur-lined caps and loaded the first shells. The night was silent, save for the faint growl of diesel motors. When dawn broke, they moved like ghosts through the frost. From a distance, the Germans thought they were hallucinating, enemy tanks cutting across snow without effort. The T-34s didn't need paved roads. Their broad tracks floated over drifts that trapped the lighter Panzers. When the Soviets opened fire, the sound was muffled but deadly. German trucks burst into flame. Machine gun nests disappeared beneath collapsing walls of snow and smoke. For the first time, it was the Soviets who struck fast and hard. At a crossroads outside Klin, a German officer screamed into his radio, "We're being overrun by ghosts, by iron ghosts." The myth of Blitzkrieg, unstoppable, perfect, was collapsing under the weight of its own momentum. Every mile eastward, the Wehrmacht had lost speed, supplies, and sanity. The T-34 had become the embodiment of what the Germans feared most, a machine not built for brilliance, but for endurance. Captured tanks were hauled back to Germany for study. Engineers gathered around them like surgeons, tracing their lines, measuring their angles, and shaking their heads. The sloped armor, simple, elegant, became a revelation. Within months, German factories were retooling designs for what would become the Panzer. But it was too late to reclaim the advantage. By 1942, the Soviets were producing T-34s by the thousands, rolling off assembly lines faster than the Germans could destroy them. Factories in Stalingrad, Chelyabinsk, and Nizhny Tagil worked night and day, manned by women, students, and veterans. Even as bombs fell, the machines kept coming. And with each new model, improved guns, thicker armor, the legend grew. Soviet crews began to believe in their tank as something more than metal. It was survival. It was vengeance. It was the roar of their homeland itself. At the Battle of Moscow, columns of T-34s thundered forward through the blizzard. The once proud Panzer divisions broke and retreated, leaving behind wreckage and disbelief. The German High Command realized the truth. The Blitzkrieg was dead, and the T-34 had killed it. Back in Berlin, a shaken officer laid his report on Hitler's desk. The Führer stared at the photographs, those angular hulls, those sloped sides, and asked quietly, "Why didn't we build one like this?" The engineer beside him replied, "Because we never thought we'd need to." Outside, the eastern wind howled across Europe, carrying with it the sound of turning steel, the sound of a new war being forged.